Hey guys, what's up? It's Alex over at Laser Everything, and today we're going to be talking about what to be looking at when trying to buy a Galvo laser, some of the features, some of the anatomy, a bunch of different stuff. It's basically going to be an all-inclusive, everything you need to know about Galvo lasers. It is kind of a spiritual successor to our 2021 fiber laser buying guide, but this time we're including information about all different kinds of Galvo lasers, including UV and CO2 Galvos, and a bunch of other stuff. We won't be getting into specific brands that I recommend, though we'll have a follow-up video soon that talks about those. That's something I'm going to be working on in the near future, but for right now this is kind of a technical guide on just what to look out for, kind of understand the systems, how they work, what makes them different from Gantry lasers, and a bunch of other great stuff. So don't go anywhere because we're getting started right now. Okay guys, so let's get right into it with the Holy Trinity. If you've been watching the channel for a while, this is probably a term that you've heard me throw around, and the Holy Trinity is ultraviolet or UV, CO2, and fiber. The UV lasers are excellent for engraving glass, transparent surfaces, and most plastics, but it can struggle with depth. It's pretty slow and also fairly expensive, but it's very versatile for use with just about every material. You can mark metal, you can engrave wood, you can do plastics, all kinds of plastics, even plastics you can't do with other lasers. It does really well, again, with transparent surfaces, so things like acrylic. It's going to do excellent where other lasers would pass through. The UV is actually going to mark that. And of course, it can engrave glass, and we've even successfully cut glass with the UV laser. So UV has its uses, and while expensive, if these are the types of materials you plan on working on, you should seriously consider an ultraviolet laser. CO2 is on the list, and this is a video about Galvo lasers. Most CO2 lasers that you find out in the wild are gantry lasers, so they're riding on rails that are driven by stepper motors, but CO2 also comes in Galvo format, and it's for really specific things. Written here we have excellent for larger projects with the gantry form factor, but it's great with organics such as wood and leather, and very good at removing paints and coatings. Now CO2 Galvo lasers have some issues, and we'll talk about those a little later on in the episode, but if you're looking to do a lot of wood and you're doing the same thing over and over again and you want to get it done very, very, very fast, the CO2 Galvo could be a good choice for you. And then the other thing, it's the master at removing things like powder coat or Cerakote, right, without marking the metal underneath. This is particularly popular in applications where we are looking at like powder coated tumblers, and there's very high repeatability here, and you don't have to worry so much about the settings because the CO2 is incapable of marking the metal. So CO2 Galvo, definitely a specific choice, but a very good one if it meets your needs. And then lastly, of course, we have the fiber laser. The fiber laser is probably why you're here. It's the best laser for marking and engraving metals and dark stones. Every metal from tin to titanium can be marked or engraved deeply with these machines. And you've probably done enough research to know this if you've made it this far and you found the channel here, but fiber lasers are exceptional at what they do, and that's marking metal and engraving it, removing metal from the surface. Other lasers like the CO2 can only mark the surface or remove coatings or paints or anodizing. The fiber is actually removing metal from the material, right? So if you're looking to primarily be working with metal, fiber is the way you want to go. So why would you choose a Galvo laser? Well, there's a lot of different reasons why you would want a Galvo laser over a traditional gantry system. Lightning fast job completion, okay? You can do things 100 times faster with a Galvo laser than you can a Gantry. It doesn't require sharpened tools, so if you come from like a milling or like, you know, you've used an X-carve or something like that, you don't have to worry about bits or like any of that milling setup. We're marking and engraving with light, right? So there's a lot less to worry about there. They have really long lifespans. This varies from laser to laser, but on average you see 50 to 100,000 hours thrown around quite a bit, and that's because they don't really have a lot of moving parts. The only parts in this machine that are actually moving around are the servo motors that control the mirrors inside the Galvo head. In a worst case scenario, you could just swap out the Galvo head if something went terribly wrong, which brings us to our next point: maintenance free. They don't require a lot of maintenance. If you keep your lenses clean, that's pretty much all you need to do to take care of a machine like this, and they're relatively inexpensive. Now, I know when you're looking at price tags and you see anything ranging from $2,000 to $10,000, that doesn't sound inexpensive, but these machines used to be so expensive that only commercial, industrial entities could afford to purchase these lasers for their operations, and the price is coming down so far now, especially with the import market the way that it is, that normal people like you and me can actually afford to buy these lasers. And lastly, and this is going to trigger some people, but easy to use software. Now, Ezcad has its problems, right? But I think in the long haul, Ezcad, compared to other professional softwares for other industries, is fairly easy to learn and use. Once you understand the basic concepts behind how your laser works, the software itself is fairly straightforward. The biggest problems that we have with Ezcad are typically related to stability, so it crashes a lot. You know, we get a lot of errors and things like that. But as far as actually using the software, I think it's pretty simple. The other thing that we have to look forward to is Lightburn. Lightburn will be coming out for Galvo lasers very, very soon here, which of course is immensely easy to learn and use. So, you know, Lightburn on the horizon, and I think, again, in the grand scheme of things, Ezcad, as far as a professional software for like a professional piece of equipment goes, is pretty straightforward. So let's talk about some of the differences between Gantry lasers and Galvo lasers. With a Gantry laser, the laser beam is reflected to a head, which redirects it to the material. The head has to move to each marking position along the path, so you can't just project it onto the surface like you would with a Galvo. The head actually physically has to move to every single point in the marked job in order to mark in those locations. And since that laser head has a lot of mass, it has to move slowly to maintain accuracy. If we start going super duper fast with all of that weight, it's going to lead to big problems. So relatively speaking, in the laser world, gantries have to move fairly slow in order to maintain that accuracy. Now, there are gantry lasers like the Aeons or Thunder lasers of the world that have gotten very good at moving that mass very quickly, but that does come with an additional expense, and even then, with the CO2s, at least, it can't match the speed of something like a CO2 Galvo. It just can't move at thousands of millimeters per second, so they are quite a bit slower, but that doesn't mean they don't have their uses. Gantry lasers are great at large projects. They typically have smaller dot sizes than their Galvo counterparts, so there are some reasons that you would want to use gantry lasers, but we're here today to talk about Galvos. Galvo lasers work way differently than a gantry laser. Instead of being directed to a head which moves around the work area, on a Galvo laser, the laser is reflected by two mirrors in what we call the Galvo head. That's that yellow block right there, and they're moving at incredible speeds. They have way less mass to move around because instead of moving that giant head, they're just moving those two small mirrors, which results in higher speed and better accuracy. Those two mirrors in turn project raster and vector images onto the surface, so the Galvo head is not actually moving anywhere. There are exceptions to this, of course. There are moving Galvo head assemblies, but that's outside of the scope of the video today. And so those images are projected onto the surface and marked, and all without having to move any of the actual equipment. We're just moving those mirrors around in order to get that laser to mark our material. Since we're projecting the laser beam onto the material, it actually comes with some pretty cool benefits, and one of those is the projected preview. All three of these types of lasers, UV, CO2, and fiber, can project a preview, so you can see your results before you're actually marking it and adjust your position on the fly, which is amazing. Everybody who's used a Gantry laser before knows about framing and how difficult that can be when you're trying to frame something onto a part to make sure that it's going into the right spot. And with a Galvo laser, you simply don't have to worry about that. You can set up your preview and light it, and a red dot laser, or in the UV's case, a low-powered version of the UV laser, will light up the actual project on the part so you can see exactly where things are going to go before you hit the mark button, and that's pretty cool. So really quick, let's talk about how these things are built and their basic components. The fiber laser is a bit different from the CO2 and UV, so we'll talk about those in a second. But with the fiber laser, we have over here on the left the case, the controller that's giving the commands to the Galvo head to let it know what to do and when to fire the laser. And then we have the laser source, and note the laser source is not in the laser path with the actual laser assembly. It is in a separate unit with its power supplies and such, and the beam is carried via a fiber optic cable all the way up to the laser path, where it is then bounced into the Galvo head and then projected through the lens down onto the work table. So that's the very, very basic anatomy of a fiber laser. Now, if we take a look at CO2 and UV, we can see that things are just a little bit different. We still have our case and controller, but the controller is now just sending data and power over that line. So we don't have a fiber optic cable in this case. We just have data and power moving to what we would call the laser path on the fiber. Instead of a laser path, we actually have the laser source. So for both the UV and the CO2, the box up behind the Galvo head is the laser source. So the beam is being generated right there and then being projected through the Galvo head and through the lens. So that's the main difference between the UV and CO2 and a fiber laser, is that the fiber laser is generated, I guess you could say, off-site, whereas the UV and CO2 are being generated directly behind the Galvo head. So if we start breaking down these anatomies a little bit, we can start talking about some of the individual components so that you know what to look for if you're in the market for one of these or looking to understand a laser you've already bought a little bit better. The first thing is the controller. The vast majority of controllers that run Galvo lasers are Ezcad controllers. They're made by a company called JCZ, and there are two main different kinds of Ezcad boards. There are a few sub boards that are kind of offshoots of the main boards, but the main two are Ezcad 2 boards and Ezcad 3 boards, and we can see some of the differences here. For one, Ezcad 2 is 32-bit software, whereas Ezcad 3 is 64-bit software. Ezcad 2 is also significantly older. It was published in 2004, whereas Ezcad 3 was published in 2015. Since Ezcad 2 is 32-bit software, it can only really use up to 4 gigabytes of memory on the computer, and when you're working with large graphics or highly complicated graphics, it can be a huge strain to get any work done, whereas Ezcad 3 is unlimited memory use. So that's really nice. It handles large files much better than Ezcad 2 does. Ezcad 2 is riddled with bugs as well. It's kind of got abandoned. They never really finished polishing it up before moving on to Ezcad 3, so wherever things were when they stopped working on it, that's just how they're stuck forever. Whereas Ezcad 3 has had a lot more time put into refinement to make things operate smoothly. It still has its problems, but it is a significant improvement. And then of course, Ezcad 3 has 3D features. So if you're looking for a 3D Galvo or a 3D scan head that can actually adjust focus on the fly to get around curved objects, if that's something that you're interested in, Ezcad 3 is going to be the way that you're going to want to go. But I would actually urge most people to go for Ezcad 2. And the big reason for that is because Lightburn is coming. Lightburn currently only supports Ezcad 2 boards. That's the connection here. If you want to be able to purchase Lightburn for Galvo when Lightburn for Galvo is released, and it should be, I mean, really, really soon now. We're coming right up on release. If you want to use that upon release, you have to have an Ezcad 2 board. We actually have a guide on how to downgrade, so if you have an Ezcad 3 board and you'd like an Ezcad 2 board so that you can use Lightburn when it comes out, we have a guide on that. I'll throw a card up in the corner and a link in the description, but there's going to be huge benefits that come along with Lightburn for Galvo support, and it's just going to be an amazing piece of software. It's actively developed in America. It's the most common laser software in the world. If you've ever gone online, pretty much ever, and watched a laser video with a Gantry laser in it, you've probably seen Lightburn being used. It's just everywhere. There's massive online support since everybody uses it, and since it's so common, so there's a ton of information on it, and how its functions and features all work. And it's a highly polished piece of software that's made by people who really care. And so we're super excited about that here over at Laser Everything. So if you haven't already made a laser purchase yet, I highly recommend getting Ezcad 2 over Ezcad 3. It will suck for a little bit for now, but as soon as it's released, it's going to make it so much easier for you to have an Ezcad 2 board to get your hands on all of the awesome features and stability that Lightburn's bringing to the table here. So definitely recommending Ezcad 2 for now. There may be Ezcad 3 support in the future, but they haven't confirmed that yet, and I don't think they've even begun looking into it yet, so I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket. And the downgrade, like I mentioned, is fairly simple, so go for Ezcad 2 for now. The next big thing is the laser source. These are fiber laser sources, and since fiber lasers are the most common type of Galvo laser, I just wanted to mention them really quick. All three of these companies manufacture laser sources in China. On the left we have Max. It's the least expensive, but it's less reliable, and there are many different models and spec lists to keep up with, so it's kind of hard to tell what their product line is and what exactly you want to be looking for. They also have a lot of like white label products, so they will build sources for machines and not put their name on them. So it can be kind of hard to tell what exactly is in your machine if you get a Max machine, make or model. So, typically I advise against buying a Max, especially for your first laser. I wouldn't want anybody to have a Max source for their first machine and then have something go wrong with it and then they're just out of laser. And it's more likely with a Max. Last year I made a video on what fiber laser to buy in 2021, and I said avoid Max like the plague. I take that back a little bit. They've certainly been trying really hard, it seems, to up their game and make their product better, and they have made progress, but I think overall I would still, for a first-time user or someone who's just getting started, recommend a Raycus or a JPT so that you can start with something really rock solid. And then if you're looking at like a travel machine or a second machine to have in your shop and you want to save a couple bucks, then maybe the Max source is worth looking at and could be a good buying decision. So I'm upgrading my opinion of Max from avoid at literally all costs to maybe for a second or mobile machine. Next up we have Raycus, which is extremely common. Raycus has been around for a really long time. It tackles most jobs well, and it's a great value. They're relatively inexpensive sources. The only real downside to Raycus machines is that they generally have a limited frequency range, typically from 25 kilohertz to around 100 kilohertz. They do make MOPA lasers. That is a thing that Raycus makes, but they're rare. And they're expensive. So generally you're going to be kind of stuck in the lower end of frequency ranges with a Raycus laser source. But overall, especially if you're on a budget, Raycus is a great way to go. JPT, more expensive, but extremely versatile. It's very easy to anneal with these machines thanks to their larger frequency range. So their LP sources, which are the fixed pulse width version of their laser source, offer a frequency range of 1 to 400, or on some units 1 to 600 kilohertz. And then on their MOPA lasers, you're seeing more like 1 to 4,000 kilohertz. So really huge frequency range on these machines, and that's just going to afford you more options when you are trying to mark new materials in different ways. So I'm a big JPT fanboy. I've always loved JPT. I really like their sources, and I would highly recommend that you start with a JPT if you are considering to buy a laser, just so that you don't have doors closed for you when you're getting started. If you can afford it, I absolutely recommend getting them. It's still a fraction of the price of other higher end laser sources on the market. So JPT still the #1 way to go if you're asking me. So let's talk about F-Theta lenses now. They work the same way whether we're talking about fiber, CO2 Galvo, or UV. And so the first thing that we want to take a look at is the numbers along the bottom. There are different sized lenses. So on the left we have a 110 lens, on the right we have a 300. The top right corner shows you how these different lenses are denoted or marked so that you know which lens is which. Notice on the 300 by 300 millimeter lens, we see the f/420. That is the approximate focal distance, not the field size. So that's approximately how far the lens will be from the material. The 300 by 300 is the actual lens size. If we look in the top left corner up here, you can see f equals 160, so this would be our 110 millimeter lens, which will be approximately 160 millimeters from the surface of our material. So that's how you read that. 110, 150, 175, 200, 250, and 300, all common lens sizes. They even go smaller than 110. You can get 70s or 50 millimeter lenses as well. So there is certainly a lot of options out there, and they are all good for different things. So we can talk about some of the ways that they're different now and why it matters. The first thing you're going to notice when you're looking at two different lens sizes is the dot size. The 110 lens has a smaller workspace, obviously. It's 110 millimeters by 110 millimeters, but it also has a smaller dot size, and we do get some benefits from having a smaller dot size. First of all, we get more detail. So if we're trying to engrave things like photos, that smaller dot size lets us pack more data and more detail into the same amount of area that we would be fitting in with a larger lens. And also we have a higher power density. Let's say we were choosing a lens for our 30-watt laser. On the left with the 110 millimeter lens, that 30 watts of power is going to be focused to that smaller point. Whereas the 200 millimeter lens on the right, that 30 watts of power is going to be spread out over a much larger area. And so that's where we get into the larger lenses. We have a larger workspace, so we can cover a lot more area, but to pay for that, we also have a larger dot size. That obviously means less detail, but it also means a lower power density. So if you have a great setting for your 110 lens where you're engraving aluminum, you're going to notice that it feels weaker on the 200 millimeter lens, and that's because the same amount of energy is being applied over a wider area. Typically, you want to make sure that you have the power you need to drive a lens of a certain size. For 25, 30 watt lasers, going over 200 millimeters really is an exercise in futility. It can be very hard to get any ablation with those kinds of lenses if you've only got 30 watts of power at your disposal. Whereas the 50 watt can handle things over 200 no problem. You can go all the way up to 300 millimeter lenses with a 50 watt laser. So just keep in mind that the dot size on larger lenses is going to be bigger, and that means that you're going to get less detail, and it's going to be harder to get the same amount of power out of those lenses because of the larger dot size. The other thing that's really important to remember is that the larger your workspace, the further away your lens has to be from your material. This is important because there are different tower sizes. We recently did a video where we used the 300 millimeter lens, and we talk about why it's so much easier to use that lens with a larger tower. I'll again throw a card up in the corner for you and a link in the description if you want to check that out for kind of some real world application of what we're talking about here. But I did write it down. Lenses with larger workspaces must be further away from the material in order to project the laser accurately. So in this very simple graphic right here, you can see the 110 lens is much closer to the material, the 200 millimeter lens much further away. So that's all there is to say about that. It's a pretty simple thing, but it can affect your workflow, so it's something that's important to know. Lastly, we have depth of field. If there's any photographers out there, you're familiar with this concept, but this is just the amount of space, the amount of depth that is in focus for our light, in this case our laser beam. Lenses with larger workspaces have a deeper depth of field, allowing you to remain in focus through greater height differentials. So if we were doing some kind of curved object, something with a little slope to it, on the left, anything within that green area right there would be in focus. On the right, you can see that's a much taller box. So when we're talking about a large lens, like a 200 millimeter lens, we're not just talking about the 200 millimeters wide by 200 millimeters tall, but it's also going to afford us more depth. So it really helps to think about this not as a square workspace, but as a cube. And it's not a perfect cube, right? We're not going to get 200 millimeters of depth and focus, but it is a 3D shape that we're talking about here. And so the larger that field size, the larger that depth of area that we're going to be able to remain in focus around curves. So there are a lot of different examples, kind of like the video that I just linked a couple minutes ago to the red powder-coated tumbler video, where we actually show how the larger lenses do a better job remaining in focus around curves. And this is why, because those larger workspace lenses, the larger focal distance lenses, also have a deeper depth of field where the laser is going to remain in focus and give us a consistent mark throughout. So very important, very key to understand if you're getting a laser. If you plan on doing anything with any sort of roundness to it, any sort of depth, you really want to have a nice big lens, and that means you need a good amount of wattage to drive that big lens. So all things to consider when looking at Galvo lasers. And again, all of this F-Theta lens stuff applies regardless of the kind of laser we're talking about, whether we're talking about a UV, a CO2, or a fiber laser. All of this stuff is totally applicable. So here's some more terms you've probably heard about when looking at different kinds of laser marking systems. One of them is continuous wave, and the other is pulsed lasers. Continuous waves are the way that CO2 gantry machines operate. The beam turns on and it fires until it turns off, which I know it sounds silly, but bear with me. So the continuous wave lasers are a constant, uninterrupted beam. It's very common with DC CO2 glass tubes, and it's often utilized for fiber laser cleaning machines and fiber laser welders. So continuous wave, the laser's on until the computer tells it to turn off, and then it's off. Most Galvo laser marking machines are pulsed lasers. The laser is charged before each pulse, so it's blipping. It's not a constant on beam, even when it appears to be on the entire time. If you're viewing the laser while it's operating, it appears like it's a non-stop force, but it's actually pulsing very, very quickly. It's very common with Galvo laser marking machines, and it generally has a higher energy impact on the material. That's because for each pulse, the laser is a little time to charge up that extra energy. I'm, again, oversimplifying things here, but just to put a picture in your head about generally how these work. For most marking applications, pulse lasers are what you're going to see. Now, like we've been saying a lot this episode, pulsed lasers, very deep topic. We can get super far into it, but there is one important thing I want to point out to you about these laser sources, and one of the features of having a pulsed laser that's really important when you're making your buying decision, and that is your maximum pulse output power. In some documentation, like on this RAKUS spec sheet, it's called single pulse energy. On this JPT sheet here, it's called maximum pulse energy. But basically what this means is this is how much power the laser can put out per pulse at its max. And that depends on your frequency. Again, it gets a little more complicated, but really this is a very good gauge for how strong your laser actually is. Here we can see for this RAKUS machine, this is for the 20 watt and 30 watt RAKUS machines, the maximum pulse energy or single pulse energy is 1, and this is 1 millijoule of energy. Okay, so it tells you even at the frequency in which it is most powerful on this spec sheet. So it's 1 at 20 kilohertz or 1 at 30 kilohertz for the 30 watt. If we compare that to the LP series JPT sources, we can see for the 20 and 30 watts it's 0.8, and for the 50 watt it's 1.25. So the 20-30 watts actually a little weaker, but the 50 watt is actually a little more powerful. Now these numbers don't vary by a huge range, but they do make a very noticeable difference when you're actually using the machine. So 0.8 and 1.25 for the 20, 30, and 50 watt LPs. Let's check out their MOPA offerings. So here's the 20 watt M7 and the 30 watt M7, and here we can see these both have a maximum pulse energy of 0.8. Okay, It's also worth it to check out some of the higher powered machines as well. So here we can see the single pulse energy for the 10 watt, 20 watt, 30 watt, and 50 watt, a couple different various models of Raycus sources, and they range here. So anywhere from 1 to 0.66. So this 20 watt QE is actually fairly weak. You're going to have a hard time using this source, so it does matter. And then, of course, we can't talk about maximum pulse energies without looking at the MOPA JPT sources, the M7, where we actually have a range here between 1.5 and 2.0 millijoules per pulse. So it's just something you want to pay attention to. You're still going to get more power out of an 80 watt laser than you are out of a 30 watt, even if those two values are the same. And this variation between the max pulse energy is a huge reason why settings on my machine might not work the same exact way as settings on your machine. This is a huge factor here, the maximum pulse energy. So it's something you want to pay attention to. Generally, higher the output, the better. You're going to get faster results. You're going to be able to ablate more material with your fiber laser if you have a higher pulse energy. Again, it's a lot more complicated than this, but I did just want to take a second to try to break that down and explain it, because it's something that you should be looking at when you're considering different lasers. With that in mind, we can talk about some laser parameters. We have the speed, which is the speed at which the Galvo mirrors direct the beam across the material. So we're actually telling those mirrors how fast to move while it's moving the beam around. We have power, so some lasers have a power percentage that you can set, and that's the percentage of available power being directed at the material. 0 to 100%. If you have a 30 watt laser, 100% power would be 30 watts. If you have a 50 watt laser, 100% power would be 50 watts. Then we have the frequency. So we talked about continuous wave versus pulsed lasers. The frequency is the number of laser pulses created in a given amount of time. The more pulses that you have, the higher the frequency. Also, the more pulses that you have, the less energy you can get into each pulse. So typically at higher frequencies, you'll see a less impactful impact on the material itself. And then some lasers have what's called pulse duration, and that's the length of each pulse at a given frequency. So you can have so many pulses per second, but now we're talking about how long each of those pulses is maintained for. Now, not all lasers have all of these parameters. Power is a great example. Not all machines have a power setting. The UV, for example, has just frequency and pulse duration and speed. There is no power setting. The UV laser runs at 100% power all the time, and you vary the frequency and pulse duration in order to give the effect of higher or lower power. We could spend a whole lot of time on this topic alone, different laser parameters, and in fact we may in the future, in a future video. But for today, I just wanted to give you an overview just to kind of give you an idea of what these are doing. Speaking of giving ideas, let's chat for a moment about MOPA lasers. This is a fiber-specific technology, so we're not really going to be talking about MOPA lasers in CO2 or UV context, but the number one thing that you hear about MOPA lasers is that they're able to do color marking on steel. MOPA lasers can aid in doing color marking on steel and some other ferrous metals if you know what you're doing and you have a ton of practice. But the reality is a lot less fun than the sensational videos that you see online, and I feel like it's my personal mission to warn everybody about how difficult these machines can be to use. The reality of colors on steel is not a super exciting one. There are 1,000 variables that will affect the outcome. Everything from the temperature in the room to the temperature of the material can all have an effect on the colors that you get, the finish of the material, when the material was made, how it was made. It's very, very deep and complex topic, and that's why you haven't seen a lot of MOPA content on the channel yet, because I don't even fully understand it, if I'm being completely honest with you guys right now. It's a very deep topic, and it takes a lot of research and a lot of learning to even get your foot in the door with getting the results that people advertise these lasers can do. They're difficult to master. It takes a lot of practice, and it's extremely inconsistent, right? All of those variables that I mentioned and a whole lot more that I did not mention are all going to affect your marking every single time that you try to use a MOPA laser for a color marking application. There's also been a lot of issues where the color marking that MOPA lasers can do tend to rust very quickly if you're not immediately treating them or doing something to prevent that material from oxidizing. So it's hard, guys. It's a very, very steep, very long learning curve. I'm not saying it can't be done. It absolutely can be done, and some people do it to great effect. But just know that you are getting yourself into a whole can of worms here, and it's going to take a long time to get really good at it. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that most people are going to be able to be very helpful with, so you're going to be largely on your own. This image over here on the right is just not realistic, especially when you're just getting started. You're just learning how to use these machines. That said, I don't think that no one should buy a MOPA laser. There are some awesome, legitimate reasons for having one. Typically, they offer a larger frequency range, so that larger frequency range is going to let you do things like annealing much easier than something like a Raycus, where you're stuck in the 25 to 100 kilohertz range. MOPA lasers generally have a far wider frequency range on them. It also allows you to maintain power at higher frequencies. So earlier in this video, we mentioned that the higher the frequency is, the more pulses, and the more pulses, the less time you have for each pulse, so it's typically weaker. Being able to set that pulse duration, the amount of time that it takes to do the pulse, really opens up more power for you at the higher frequency ranges, so that you can do more pulses without necessarily losing power. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to do this. If that's something that you need, you probably already know. We're not going to get super into it today, again, kind of outside the scope of this video, but just know that you can maintain power at higher frequencies with a MOPA laser, where you may not necessarily be able to do that with a standard fiber laser machine. It also allows a finer control over the application of heat. The whole reason we can do color markings on steel and other ferrous materials is because of the heat that we're applying to the surface of the metal to change the color. MOPA lasers give you a very fine control over that applied heat. Now, color marking might not be the only instance that you want to control the application of heat on the material, and in those cases, a MOPA laser could be very helpful. Finally, MOPA lasers are often the higher wattage systems. So if you plan on doing a lot of cutting or a lot of very deep engraving that isn't necessarily color centric, the higher wattage laser systems, typically 60 to 100 watt lasers, are going to be MOPA. Whether you need them to be a MOPA laser or not, the higher wattage systems typically are. So those are all actual MOPA laser uses. Those are all reasons you could actually want one of these. That doesn't have anything to do with the color that you're getting on the material. Just know what you're getting, why, and what the challenges are going to be before you move forward. I think being realistic about color marking is hard because it's so cool, but I think it's essential to make sure you're making a good laser purchase and understand your equipment. Another thing that you really want to watch out for, and this one is for our CO2 Galvo guys, is the dot size with beam expanders and Galvo heads. This is a whole thing, and we have to talk about it. So CO2 lasers have a much larger dot size than a fiber or a UV laser, and a lot of people that pick up a CO2 Galvo think that when they uncrate the thing and they get some material under there, it's going to perform with the same fidelity that fiber and UV lasers are capable of, and that's simply not true. Compared to the fiber and UV, the CO2 Galvo is like trying to do a sketch with a Sharpie instead of a fine point pen. You're just going to have this big fat dot size, and the detail's really, really rough, especially with the 10mm head that ships with a lot of these CO2 Galvo machines. But there are ways around this. We can make improvements to our CO2 Galvo systems, and we're going to talk about how some of those improvements work. The basic one, the important one, is called the beam expander. Here on the left we can see our normal diameter beam coming out of our CO2 laser source, and the 2x beam expander makes it twice as wide, and then it exits the F-Theta lens and hits the material. The larger the beam width going into an F-Theta lens, the smaller it comes out. So we want to actually make our beam as wide as possible before hitting our lens, because it will give us the smallest point possible when it exits. On the right side over here, we can see the 20mm head with the 6x beam expander. So the same exact diameter beam enters the Galvo head. It passes through the 6x beam expander and it becomes 6 times wider. And then after passing through our F-Theta lens, we actually have a much smaller dot. So notice, thinner goes in, thicker comes out on the left, thicker goes in, thinner comes out on the right. So we can make up for these very big dot sizes, but we need to have the right equipment. Here I've just kind of thrown together a quick little diagram for you to show you how it works and why we actually need to upgrade our heads. So let's say we're starting with a 3mm beam. If we pass that through a 3x expander, it gives us a 9mm beam, which our 10mm head mirrors can carry. That 10mm head has 10mm mirrors inside of it, so our 9mm beam fits comfortably on those. Now, the first thing you need to upgrade in order to get a smaller dot size is your beam expander. We want a nice, big, thick beam, right? So we need to expand that beam. So let's upgrade our 3x expander to a 6. So we're starting with the same 3mm beam, which passes through the 6x expander, and now we have an 18mm beam. But look what happens. Our 18mm beam doesn't fit on the 10mm head's mirrors, and all of that power that is going past the mirrors and isn't being reflected by them, we're losing that power. So we're actually going to make our system a lot weaker by using a beam expander that is too big for our currently equipped head. So what do we need to do? We need to upgrade our head as well. So in this example, the top scenario is the same. It's a 3mm beam through a 3x expander, which gives us a 9mm beam. That fits comfortably on our 10mm head. But in the bottom example, we've upgraded our Galvo head as well as our expander. So now the 3mm beam is passing through the 6x expander to give us an 18mm beam. And that 18mm beam fits perfectly on our 20mm head mirrors. So we're not going to be losing any power. Nothing is not going to be reflected. All of our laser will make it down to the surface of the material because we're using a head and mirrors that are large enough for the beam expander we've chosen. So looking back at this first graphic again, just to put a bow on it, you need a certain size Galvo head in order to use a certain size beam expander, and you want to use the biggest beam expander you can because the larger the beam goes in, the smaller it comes out, right? And we're after those really fine dot sizes so we can get the best power density and we can get the best detail out of our CO2 Galvo as possible. We're getting close to the end here, guys, but I did just want to take a minute to talk about the laser safety classes. The two big ones are Class 1 lasers and Class 4 lasers, and there are some big differences. So let's just chat about some of these differences really quick. The Class 1 laser does not allow the user to access the laser while it is firing. So any system where the door is closed and has like an interlock switch or something like that, that would be a Class 1 laser. There are some pros and cons to this. Limited space for marking larger items, so whatever it is that you want to mark has to actually fit inside the closed enclosure in order to mark it. It also reduces the visibility of items being marked. May not be a huge deal for some people, but here on YouTube we really care about that. But it does have the lowest risk for damage to vision. Since the machine is completely enclosed, you're not going to burn out your eyes, and you can be a lot more relaxed around your machine. Class 4 lasers, on the other hand, allow users direct access to dangerous areas of the machine while operational. If you've seen a fiber laser running, you know that most of these are Class 4 machines. Stuff goes on the table and it's just marked right there out in the open. This is a lot more versatile for positioning options, so you can turn things however you want, position them however you want, build jigs however you want, and you can accept larger items for marking. Since there are no walls getting in your way, you can grab pretty much any item, and if it fits between the bed and the scan head, you're in luck. You're in good shape, and you're going to be able to mark that item. The thing about Class 4 lasers is that they're very dangerous if safety procedures are not followed. Eye protection has to be worn. You have to be especially careful around class 4 lasers, because at any time the laser beam could reflect off the material, and it just takes one shot to the eye and your vision's going to be messed up. So it is really important. And we're not talking just about literal mirrors here, guys. Different materials, especially with the fiber laser on metals, different materials can be molecularly reflective, which means that like atom by atom, they could be reflecting photons that aren't being absorbed. We'll do another video on this sometime about the dangers of IR lasers and UV lasers and reflections, but just know it's very, very dangerous to use class 4 lasers if you aren't protecting yourself appropriately. So please wear personal protective equipment if you're going to be operating a class 4 laser. It's very important. The last thing I wanted to cover in today's video are some of the Galvo laser form factors. I get this question a lot. So on the left over here, we've got this guy. He's got a box on the floor, and he's actually holding the laser path and pointing his laser at the item that he wants to mark or clean, especially. Laser cleaning machines typically come in like this handheld format with those continuous wave lasers that we talked about earlier. Handheld is great for very specific use cases, but it comes with a lot of problems too. Being able to focus right the first time can be an issue because you don't have a fixed bed. Swapping lenses can be a pain, but I mean, that said, they are pretty cool, and you can just kind of pop them up against anything, anywhere. You can take it with you and point it at stuff and mark it. So that's pretty cool if you have a system worked out for operating a laser like that. I typically don't recommend those to people though. The next one, and probably the most popular one, is the portable setup. This is the class 4 setup that we were talking about, where we have a separate case and a separate laser unit with a workbench on it. You're going to see the portables all the time. They're very popular, and for good reason. They're super easy to use, they're space efficient, and they give you a lot of control over how you want to actually set your laser up in your workflow so that you can be productive with your machine. And then lastly, we have the workstation laser. Very heavy, difficult to move around. They kind of live where they sit, despite a lot of them having wheels so that they can actually be carted from place to place. If you're going to get a class 1 type fiber laser system or CO2 or UV system, it's generally going to be in this workstation format with a door that opens and closes so that you can have the door closed while you're working with your equipment. These are more popular than the handhelds, but not quite as popular as the portable. That said, I do see them around, so if safety is your absolute number one 100% priority, the workstation may be the way to go for you. Just make sure that it has an enclosure or a door on it. And that's all we've got to talk about today, guys. So I hope this episode was helpful for you. I hope you understand more about the different kinds of Galvo lasers, what sets one apart from another, and maybe clues you in on some information about a machine you already own or something you're looking to buy. As usual, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments or check out our Discord or Facebook groups. There's a huge community of people there that love to help out, so if you want to ask some questions to a broader group of people, that's a great place to do it as well. There's links to both of those down in the description. And if you got help from this video, if this video helped you out, you enjoyed watching it, smash the like button. Let everybody else know that the content is good, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you get notified the next time I upload a video. I'm really excited to announce that we just passed 1,600 members over at the Laser Master Academy, so if you'd like to support the show, that's the place to do it. It really helps me to continue making new episodes, improve the content, and get into new machines and teach new skills. So if you want to see the channel continue to thrive, please consider going and signing up over at masters.lasereverything.net. Get a bunch of goodies for signing up, like our parameter libraries. You get bonus episodes of the podcast, exclusive live streams, and a whole lot more. So definitely go check that out. Again, it's masters.lasereverything.net. We'd love to have you over there at the Laser Master Academy. And that's about all I've got, guys. Once again, I really hope that this video helped you. I hope you learned a thing or two about Galvo lasers. It's a really big world out there, and there's a lot to know, so hopefully we chipped away at a little bit of that for you today. And as always, we will see you in the next one.